terrific report. That Ron Kerry is the one who first raised the problem of part-time workers. He made it a national issue, and when they went out on strike, it wasn't just for the UPS workers, it was for all part-time workers. And that was a breakthrough, and that's why they went after him and got him out. But now we can see it's coming back. It's coming back. Well, my talk is on the Ukraine, and if Commons have read the paper and friends or have followed the news a little bit, you can see in the East Ukraine and the South that the imperialists, when they seized Kiev with a fascist coup, they got more than they bargained for in the East. It took a little time. They had to go and bring the IMF in. They had to drag the Ukraine to Europe and hook them up with the European Union. And after a while, the tide has begun to rise against the puppets in Kiev. There's a rebellion in Lugansk, in Donetsk, in Kharkiv, in the south, Odessa, in Dnipropetrovsk. I did it. And in a general way, contingents of the masses have seized administrative buildings, government buildings, and have built barricades and have set up defense squads. And as a result, the local police and the local military in some of these cities, especially Donetsk and Kharkov, have refused to enforce the rulings of Kiev calling for an end to the seizures. And they have labeled them as separatists to sort of whip everybody up against them. They have had anti-Russian slanders coming hot and heavy from Kiev. But everything they do hasn't been able to rehabilitate this regime politically in a huge section of the industrial part of the country. And imperialism can't do it for them. In fact, imperialism is undermining the political position of Kiev by bringing the IMF in. And everybody's waiting for the axe to fall on the pensions, on the wages, on the social services, on the gas prices, because that's the price that the IMF is demanding from the Ukrainian masses who are suffering before this because of the looting of all the oligarchs and the looting of the European businessmen. So now, if you're in the Ukraine right now and you're looking at this Kiev regime, you can see that while the U.S. pushed hard just to barrel through every legality and overthrow the elected government of Yanukovych, who of course was nothing to write home about, he was a capitalist stooge himself, but he didn't want to go with the European Union when the country was bankrupt and Russia gave them $3 billion, offered $15 billion more, no strings attached, and subsidized gas prices. Between that and the IMF and austerity, he thought his political fate lay with Russia. And he foiled the schemes of the imperialists to drag them to the West. And by the way, it wasn't just economic. The associate agreement with the EU has language that says you have to cooperate and converge militarily with the European community. Translation, you have to work with NATO. That's what it means. So when he refused this in November, that's when the demonstrations began. 3 months of them. And they began to build up and build up and build up by the National Endowment for Democracy, by the George Soros Foundation, by the Freedom Foundation, by all the CIA instrumentalities of NGOs that they have, which they got practice in 2004 during the Orange Revolution. They brought it to a crescendo just when the Europeans worked out an arrangement with Yanukovych. You remember Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, and what was the name of the ambassador? Piat. Well, caught on telephone saying, fuck the EU, and saying, well, we think Yats should be the president. That's Yatsenyuk, who's now the president, should lead the country. And that's on tape. Well, they just wiped the Europeans aside, this agreement. They tore it up, they disregarded it, and they sent the shock troops in to the parliament and all around the streets. They even raided an arsenal in Lviv and brought heavy weapons in. They never used them in this particular instance, but they brought them in. And they overthrew the legally elected government. Okay, so now where is that government now? It can't exert its authority in the country. It's economically bankrupt. It's politically weak. And it's militarily coming apart because they can't enforce the military authority in the East. So now here's the U.S. They got a hold of this government that they pushed into power, but that government is now on wobbly legs. Today, the president, Yatsenyuk, Yats, as Victoria would call him, was down in the east. He went down to Donetsk to try to talk to people, because the day before they sent soldiers in to, I believe, Kharkov, and they wouldn't fight. So this time he went down to Donetsk, where there's the People's Republic of Donetsk. That's another story. But he had a council of business people from the region, and they lit into him. What are you doing? We need more money, we need authority. You know, he put, the Kiev government put a big billionaire oligarch over the city and the region, the whole region. They put two of them. One is the richest man, and one of the richest men in Ukraine. He owns a tank factory, an airplane factory. Chocolate started out with a chocolate factory. And the other one is a steel magnate. So they had no say in it, no choice. It was imposed upon them from Kiev. And they lit into Yatsenyuk about this. And he ran away from the meeting practically. They said, how are you going to stop this stuff with Russia? What are you going to do about this? You got to take care of this. You got to stabilize the situation. We need more money. We need more autonomy. This is them, the businessmen, talking about it. And they're under pressure from the masses. So this president had to retreat from the situation. I don't know what happened when he got back to Kiev. I don't know what everybody else over there discussed in the post-mortem of what happened over in Donetsk. But it probably wasn't pretty. Now, on the other side of this, you have the Russians and Putin and his group. And what are their goals in this situation? Their goal is to reverse the political seizure of Ukraine in one way or another by U.S. imperialism and the Europeans. That's the goal. Because until they do that, if they can't succeed at that, the imperialists will be right on their doorstep in a 1,500-mile border in a region that's rich. So what do they have at their disposal? Well, it's been very much talked about, the gas question. Gas comes from Russia to the Ukraine. Ukraine is dependent on Russian gas for its industry. It's an industrial country. But not only that, it goes through the Ukraine. Part of it goes into Europe. And most of the European countries have some level of dependence on Russian gas. Now the Russian government, Putin, has a problem with this issue because it's a double-edged sword. But first of all, let me say this. Putin wrote a letter to the Europeans about this problem. And it was a very interesting letter. He pointed out, first of all, that we have been subsidizing Ukraine for years. And we still are. And we sell them gas at subsidized prices. But they won't pay us. They stopped paying. Not only that, they have a trade deficit of like $10 billion to Europe. Why? Because the Europeans sell them high-value stuff and take in minerals and agricultural products to Europe. So they owe Europe $10 billion at least. And the treasury is almost empty. So from the point of view of Russia, why can they continue to subsidize the Ukraine when the money is going right into the coffers of the European bankers and businessmen? That's an intolerable situation. Furthermore, Europe isn't doing anything to help Ukraine. They're only taxing them, that's all. They declare their intention to do this and that, and they say $14, $15 billion, but nothing has come through yet. So it's a problem for Russia economically. It has a political side to it, because the regime will blame Russia if gas prices go up. So they have to use a way of trying to unthread this to make it Ukrainian masses understand that if your gas price is going up, it's because of the West, because your country is bankrupt, and because the IMF is forcing the reduction of subsidies for gas for the population. That's part of the agreement. So Putin has been very patient about this, but the Ukrainians have refused to pay. And they owe them billions of dollars. So, but that's one lever that they have. You want this pro-imperialist Western government in Kiev? Well, you know what? This is the consequence of it. Do you want to have this anti-Russian fanatics in the parliament and in the government offices? Well, this is a consequence of it. So they need to keep that government from stabilizing itself, and they're not going to finance it stability. The other thing they have is the troops. Whether they're on the border or not, it's a matter of dispute. But it doesn't make too much difference Because if they're not on the border, they're near the border. And they have very, very modernized transport facilities, military transport facilities, very modernized battle communications. They could be over the border very shortly, if they need to. They say they're not going to, and we should take them at their word. However, it has an inhibiting effect on the reactionaries in Ukraine, who are afraid that if they go too far with their repression against the Russian people in the East, well, you never know. You could wind up with the Russian army sitting on your neck. So that's an inhibiting factor that the Russian government has in their favor of keeping this regime from consolidating. And finally, this needs to be mentioned as a matter of history. There are Russians all over Ukraine, and there's Russians in the Baltics, in Lithuania, in Latvia, in Estonia, Moldova. Why? Because they were all part of the Soviet Union. And they were spread throughout the Soviet Union in different republics. And they had equal status when they were there. It wasn't an issue. If anything, in some places they might have had a little extra privilege here and there. When the Soviet Union collapsed and they broke up the socialist system and broke up the Federation, the Soviet Union, as a political entity, these Russians in all these countries were stranded in countries that were taken over by counter-revolutionaries, like in Lithuania and Latvia, and really in very bad reactionaries, and in Ukraine too. So there's a certain element of wanting to go back to Russia, wanting to be repatriated. When they wanted to go back, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Yeltsin was the first president after the collapse who was working hand in glove with imperialism and with the IMF and with the US economic experts to dismantle the socialist system. They wouldn't let them back into the Soviet Union, into Russia, I'm sorry. They wouldn't let the Russians back over the border. So they were stranded over there in a relatively politically hostile environment. And you can understand why they would want to go back. So this lay dormant all this time. And then Russia foiled the US because they thought they were going to take the Crimea. They thought that this puppet government in Kiev would be able to get the Russians out of the fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, out of Sebastopol. Well, it didn't take Putin long. They had a referendum and everybody voted 90% or more to go back to Russia. That's not my phone, is it? Oh, it is. Yeah, sorry. Jesus Christ. So that stimulated all these Russians who were stranded, and a lot of them want to go back. And a lot of the separatism, so-called with the Russian flag, is a reflection of that. So this is what the Russians have, and they're trying to find a way without intervention to keep this government so unstable that they'll force imperialism to enter into negotiations and take up the compromise proposals that have been put forth by Putin. Very simple. Political neutrality, military neutrality, autonomy for the regions. And this puppet regime push them aside and have genuine elections in the country. That's a compromise proposal. And no, either the EU or the Russian European, the Union, the Eastern Union of the Russian that they're sponsoring. That the Ukraine doesn't have to choose between one or the other. They can have relations with both. Now that is a truly geopolitical compromise by the Russians. And if U.S. imperialism was even this much inclined to do anything but just plunge ahead, they would have at least taken it up. They haven't even discussed it. All you get is all this anti-Russian propaganda coming from Kerry, McCain, and everybody else. So they're intransigent. So what do they have? They have NATO. They have military exercises. They send more warships into the Black Sea. They send more warplanes to Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, and they're going to have war games over there, maybe, and in Poland. So they're going to shake their stick, you know, at the Russians, and try to intimidate the Ukrainians. And then they talk about the sanctions that are going to come at you. Well, and this is a digression, but I got to say this. I'm going to step back and let me give a little extra here. Think about the Iraq War. Think about the Iraq War. The Iraq War was a complete blunder by U.S. imperialism. They would have lost that war hands down if these medieval patriarchal reactionaries hadn't got in there and split the resistance up. They would have had their head handed to them. They couldn't go in the streets. They couldn't go anywhere. They were getting picked off every place until the movement got split. That's a whole nother chapter of history. Just remember that the U.S., when the neocons orchestrated that invasion, they had a 3-month plan to take over Iraq, and they sent General Bremer in there and Chalabi to come in there, and they were going to have the whole thing done after the shock and awe. It was going to be done. And they drove Saddam out of the city into hiding, and the military forces and the resistance forces faded away and came back. It was an initial disaster, you know, to be followed by resistance. Completely ill-conceived from every point of view. Now let's come to the Ukraine. Well, remember those neocons? You know who Victoria Nuland is? She's their point person in the administration. She is in charge of this operation, not solely. But the neocons are running this. And they did this. They didn't stop to think. We're going right into Russia's territory. We're going into their backyard. We're going on their border. We're threatening their very security. And guess what? They have nuclear weapons. This is the adventurous nature of U.S. imperialism, and this is the right-wing expression of it, as neocon ideology of the American empire, of quickly, by shock and awe, by moving swiftly, decisively, to establish the American empire and expand it. I'm using the word American because that's the word they use. We call it the empire of U.S. imperialism. We don't say America. America is a big place, including Latin America. So, I want to read you a quote. I want to read a quote Case in point, from the Washington Post. This was in the Washington Post, September 2013. It's an article by the Neocon president, head of the National Endowment for Democracy. His name is Gershman. And here's what he wrote. Ukraine is the biggest prize, but then he added, an even juicier target in Ukraine was Putin, who may find himself on the losing end, not just near abroad, but within Russia itself. This is the thinking. This is the thinking of the neocons. But they were so rabid about it, the way they were in Iraq, that they discounted the Iraqi masses completely. They discounted the hatred for U.S. imperialism, who had just put sanctions on them for 10 years and killed 250,000 people, or maybe double that. They forgot about that. The hatred, the seething hatred. Well, they forgot that they were going in there to impose the IMF on the Ukrainian people. They forgot about the fact that they were in the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic excuse me, for 50 years. In fact, that's when the Ukraine really became a country. Before that, it really wasn't a cohesive country until the Socialist Revolution. And that the Soviet culture is very strong in the east and the south of the Ukraine. And that's why there are statues of Lenin in every place. They have to put up defense guards around them to keep the right wing from destroying them. But they're everywhere. So this has the feeling of an adventure, because now the U.S. has got Kiev, and they got these fascists who in there that everybody knows, and they can't stabilize the East, and the country is bankrupt, and they're about to bring the hammer down on the people. So they grabbed, and they got the Russian army over there. So they're not in a truly enviable position. And it reeks of thoughtlessness and adventurism. Now that makes them more dangerous, I must say. It's not that they're in a weak position, therefore they're not dangerous. They're more dangerous. Because they may throw good money after bad money. They may go try to recoup their position in an even more adventurous way. And this is something we have to be cognizant of. They're pissed off with Russia because they wanted to get Syria and Iran, and they think Russia was in the way. Remember these Wolfowitz and his crowd? That was their great ambition. But leave that aside. I want to finish up this way. Two points. One, in the Ukraine itself, in the struggle in the East, there's a certain amount of ambivalence and confusion within the turbulence that's going on. There are those who are for Russia, and there are those who are for the struggle against the Kiev regime and the capitalists and the oligarchs as a matter of program. And I can't find it right now, it's too long, but the Barotba people, I read an interview with one of them, and he said there's two factions. There's those who are oriented to Russia, and those who are oriented to overthrowing the capitalist oligarchs and restoring the people's rights and the people's economic well-being. One of them carries the Russian flag, and the other one carries the red flag. And he said, we, Borotba, we're with the red flag. We are for overthrowing Ukrainian capitalism. We don't think Putin is our salvation. He's a capitalist, and we want to get rid of them all. And they say they're for the unity of the Ukraine. This is their program. They're the closest ones to us politically in the Ukraine right now. They have a perspective of anti-fascist struggle, but also of class struggle. Now, they may not be able to impose themselves on the movement. They may not be able to have the weight necessary to swing the movement in that direction. Maybe other forces will come in. But that doesn't mean that they don't have to have a program and that we don't have to have a program as communist internationalists. We're with that general line of thinking. We may not agree with them on all things, but as between going to Russia, which is no solution for the Ukrainian masses, no solution. The solution is to overthrow these oligarchs and take advantage of the situation and wait for the IMF to come in and rally the workers and show them the cost and so on. Anyway, I'm not going to get more further into that. Finally, I want to touch on a new problem that we have, and it was raised in a dispute with ISO, International Socialist Organization. I'm not going to quote them or anything. But it's not just ISO, it's a generic problem. They have charged us with supporting every dictator. And that Putin is just another imperialist like the US. That's their assertion. And we need to be able to answer it on the merits of the question. Forget that ISO is against the Cuban Revolution and is against and for the Syrian counter-revolution and all that. Forget that. There's a lot of people like that who are going to take that position. Well, the first thing we say to them is this: maybe that's true. But remember what Lenin said. The enemy is at home. You say you don't plague on both your houses, fight the enemy at home. That's the first thing. That's your job. You live in the belly of the beast. Fight the imperialist ruling class that sits on top of you and the world. That's number one. But let's put that aside for another day. There's a more difficult political new problem. We, as an anti-imperialist Leninist organization, for years have established how to conduct yourself in the struggle against imperialist oppression of colonial and former colonial countries, of oppressed countries. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, all these countries. And we've always said, you have to line up against imperialism with the oppressed countries when they're under attack. And why? Even though we don't like their government, we don't particularly think that Bashir Assad is anything to write home about. He's bourgeois. Same with Gaddafi at the end of his life, only he was more radical. And certainly Saddam, who repressed the communists, we weren't in his camp. But we recognize the dual character of each of these states. They had a dual character. On the one hand, they were bourgeois, and they strengthened exploitation in their own countries and oppression to some extent. But on the other hand, they were fighting imperialism to retain their independence and to keep imperialism from taking over their country and swallowing it up and making it part of the Wall Street machine. And on that basis of the dual character of those regimes, we supported them against imperialism because they were oppressed countries. And imperialism was trying to take them back. Now, if you apply that criteria to Russia, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit. It's a formula for a different situation. Russia is not an oppressed country. Not by a long shot. It's a big capitalist power with nuclear weapons, a big military, bankers and billionaires and millionaires. So what do? Well, you use your head. You say, well, what in this situation is the interest? That's what Marxists try to do. How do we find the interest of the workers and the oppressed of the world in this struggle? Where do they lie? And then you say to your friend from your soul, what's better? Is it better for the U.S. to take over the Ukraine, swallow it up, and then take over Russia? Take the minerals, the oil, the gas, the industrial establishment, the financial resources of Russia, and suck it into the empire over here? So that they can get stronger against the workers here, against UPS, against all the proletariat here. They can buy more judges, they can buy more cops, they can buy more arbitrators. They strengthen their own state, they get blood into their system when they take Russia or the Ukraine. So which is better? Which is better? Who's the bigger enemy? And what do? We have to find a way to stop U.S. imperialism from taking over the Ukraine and from taking over and advancing to Russia's border with the goal of taking it over. That's our job as communists in the United States. Does that mean we become Putin fans? No. We have our own independent class position of class struggle, and certainly if the communists in Russia are fighting to expose Putin as an oligarch man and so on, and the same thing in the Ukraine, we're with them 100%. But the first thing is to stop the U.S. war drive in Ukraine and against Russia, because this is them trying to take back what they lost in 1917. That's what this is about. See what they said? The big prize is Putin. They said it right out like that. When they talk about sanctions, you know what they're trying to do? They're trying to get the ruling class in Russia to overthrow Putin. They're trying to twist them and hurt them economically so that they'll separate themselves from Putin because of their own profits are at stake. But that so far hasn't worked, and it may not work. Putin has just told them, well, you bring your funds back home. Get your real estate, get everything you got abroad in these foreign imperialist countries, subject to sanctions, and bring it home. Get out of the stock markets, get onto the Russian stock market. Now that's not our solution. That's his solution. But he's moving in a statist direction a little bit. State to manage the capitalist system a little bit as a defensive measure. They may get more. They can't get more. Well, anyway, I said enough. It's true. Quickly, Larry raised an important question that it's on everybody's mind. Can we see something in this that's going to germinate and revive some struggle? Now, I don't know enough to really give an educated answer to that I think in the Ukraine, in the East, it has revived. It's given an opportunity for those who are against capitalism to swim in the tide of resistance. So it's an opening, and you can see it. You can see the whole point of it. Oh, I got to say this. I want to just say what Dustin said about the Ukraine and the workers. The workers need to know about the Ukraine, and they want to know. The thinking workers want to know. And if we don't tell them, we're depriving them of knowledge. We're the only ones who are going to do it. So just keep this in mind in all of our activities about Ukraine and about capitalism and the whole 9 yards. Back to my point. There's an opening for, like Borotba. They are a young group that split from the Communist Party of Ukraine in 2011 and formed their own group because the Communist Party was too reformist for them. And right now, their position in there is fight capitalism and no to the elections on May 25th, the puppet rigged elections, and they're demanding a referendum and a boycott of the elections. And we'll see what happens on May 25th, if we get there, if we get to May 25th. But one thing was very interesting to me. Two communist lawmakers in Russia and 2 or 3 others demanded an inquiry and an investigation into Gorbachev. Why? Because he illegally dissolved the USSR. And he illegally allowed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to leave the USSR contrary to the Constitution. Yesterday, 2 days ago. And it sort of falls in line with some things that are brewing around. Now, there were communists and some others who I don't know politically who they are. And I don't want to make too much out of it, but something's in the air. Now, Putin has said, I forget when, it was in 2012 maybe, he said the collapse of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He said that, that's Putin. Now, what does he mean by that? He's thinking of the USSR as a political entity that spreads from the Pacific to Europe and down to the Caucasus and so on and up to the Arctic. So from the point of view of Russia as a power, he's thinking, wow, we lost a lot. We lost a lot. What he isn't saying, and should be saying, but he won't, is that it was based on socialism. That's what gave them this big spread, which was, by the way, based on the national question. How did the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics get formed? By Lenin's position on the national question. And all the republics, the oppressed peoples, voted to associate themselves with the Bolshevik Revolution, based upon the right of nations to self-determination and the establishment of the assembly, of the People's Assembly. I forgot the name of it. There were 2 assemblies in the USSR. There was the assembly based upon elections, and then there was the other assembly where each nationality had their representation. If it wasn't for that, there wouldn't be a USSR with this great geography. Putin doesn't remember that part. And he doesn't remember the socialist part either. But it makes you think. It makes you think what you lost and why you lost it. And I feel that this is the very earliest stage of this. It's inevitable that a reassessment is going to take place on the ground and at leadership levels about what the hell. How can we restore ourselves? How is the Ukraine going to get out of this? They're looking to further reduce them down. But they remember the USSR. A lot of the Russians. Now, if you notice these demonstrations, a lot of them seem to be of a certain age. That's not to say there's no youth involved. There are. But if you look at the pictures, you'll see people who date back to the Soviet Union and came to maturity during the USSR. And they're out there, and they remember the war against the Nazis. And Lenin has an ambiguous person over there. To some, he represents the communism, and to others, he represents Russia, you know. But whichever way you come at it, there's a nostalgia for the USSR or for this revolutionary representative. So it has to find a way to the consciousness of the people. You see, somebody said this, I think it was Rubin. This is the first time U.S. imperialism has been stopped in a march to the east. When did they stop it? When they came in and they organized the Crimea referendum, and they took the Crimea back from imperialism, which had it, through the Ukrainian government. They took their Black Sea Fleet, and they took the Crimea, and they stopped them. They stunned them. They were warning them, if you do this, you'll be isolated internationally, you will be a pariah, you can't come to any meetings, we'll cut our ties, blah, 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 blah. And they did it, and they did it with lightning efficiency. Modern military communications. Putin has modernized, in the last 5 years, the Russian military. And they came in there with electronic equipment, command, you know, in battle, command and control is everything. They were able to block the communications with the Kiev, from the Kiev to the Crimea, through electronic methods, modern technology. It stunned them, the imperialists. They got Kiev, but they haven't got the Ukraine yet, and they may not. So this is the first time since 1991 that they have been stopped in the advance to the east. Nobody has stood up to them, nobody's been able to stand up to them, but these fools went and overreached, in my opinion. So that's a very important thing, and if the Russians can hold it out, it's going to probably encourage all anti-imperialist elements, all anti-capitalist elements, without them necessarily rushing to Putin, but it will encourage them to see imperialism set back and to see the masses get into it. See, the masses are in it. That's the issue. That's the secret. And nothing that Washington can do, Kerry, McCain, whoever, can change the mind of the masses. They're pissed off. And they're in motion. And they can't politically do anything about it. They're frustrated. And they're threatening with sanctions and this and that. They forgot about Europe. Oh, Europe doesn't want that. They're doing business over there. That screws us up. That's a problem. Oh, you didn't think about that? Oh, well, where's your strategists that didn't think about the division between US and Europe in the struggle against Russia? Did you forget all that gas that comes in through the Ukraine into Russia, into Poland, into Hungary, into Romania, and all beyond? Germany, Italy, well, did you remember that when you just went there and sent those fascists in there into the parliament and declared a government that you set up? Well, okay, let's see what happens. The struggle is on. And we'll see how it comes out. But as it progresses, it's got to have an awakening effect if Putin doesn't vacillate or something. And you know, he's still a bourgeois, and anything can happen. We shouldn't get enamored of them. But so far, so good. Let me just see one more thing. About the Jews. Well, this is what you call the Zionist exception. The Sulzberger family that owns the Times are a bunch of Zionists. You say one nasty thing about Israel and you'll be on the front page, or at least on the inside page, and you'll be vilified. But Nazis with swastikas going into the Ukrainian parliament and taking it over and beating up the communists and fighting on them. Not so much. Let's talk about Putin's anti-Semitism. Whatever that is, I don't even know if it exists. Let's not talk about the Svoboda Party or the Fatherland Party. All the news that's fit to print. So I call that the Zionist exception for counter-revolutionary Nazis. And they should be called out on it. Well, that's about it. About the gas, that's important. The U.S. Energy industry is drooling over the prospect of supplying Europe with liquid natural gas. But it takes a lot of doing. You got to build the ports, you got to build the ships, you got to change the law, which forbids it right now. And there's a lot to engineer this. But that's what they live for. So this is, they see this disaster as an opportunity for them. And they won't stop until they try to do it. So, two final quick points. One, there's fascists running all around Kiev, and some of them are in the government. But it doesn't make this fascism in the Ukraine. There are fascist methods being carried out against the against the communists and the left and the radicals, and and against Lenin and all symbols of communism. And they do send them out into the East to help suppress. And we should not let them off the hook on this fascist running all around the place. And also, to some extent, Yatsenyuk and his the head of the premier, I forgot his name now, they are to some extent captives of these people because they got no police that are reliable and no military, so they're a little bit captive of them. And these, by the way, these fascists don't give a shit about Europe or anything, and they think anybody who wants to be with Europe is a softie and a liberal and probably should be destroyed because they are great nationalists, white supremacists, and so on. But and they rely on them. They're dependent to some extent. The imperialists can't fix that so easy right now. But it doesn't make it a fascist regime. You don't have a fascist regime where the president goes down to the east and begs the people to stop. It's not a fascist regime. There's plenty of fascists in it, and a lot of fascist repression. But that does not make a fascist regime, a corporate state, a crushing. If they try to do that in Ukraine, crush the unions, crush the workers down, I don't know. I don't know where it would end up. This guy, Yatsenyuk, when he went to Donetsk, he said, oh, we're not going to use force. That was his pledge. We're not going to use force. Now, maybe they will. But just the fact that he had to pledge that they won't use force against the masses shows you how weak they are.
And he said it in Russian.
Yeah, he's Russian. He's Russian.
No, he's not.
Oh, he's not?
No.
He's Ukrainian? Oh, he said it in Russian. Okay, thank you. So there you go. So anyway, and also just remember somebody brought up China. Somebody brought up China. And we mustn't forget, right now, Hegel has been in China for different conferences, and he's been talking very aggressive against China. And they just sided Japan in a very important military. You know, the Chinese excluded the Japanese from a big military exercise. And the U.S. said, okay, we're not going to send our ships either. So they showed their solidarity with Japanese imperialism, which is right now on a rampage against China. So this is the Pentagon moving in all directions, in warlike directions. This is the destiny of U.S. imperialism, to be an adventurist, militarist power, driven by the productive forces that they can't contain. And we need to just know that they're vulnerable, and we will be able to attack them soon.